On the night of September 14, 1942, in the black, rain-soaked jungle of Guadalcanal, a Japanese company commander named Captain Shigetoshi Kofuka sat beneath a shelter of broad palm leaves. He stared at the blank page of his field journal. He could not write. For almost 5 minutes, his pencil hovered over the paper, his fingers shaking slightly from exhaustion. The air was thick with the smell of rotting vegetation and cordite. Kofuka's uniform was stiff with dried mud, and his left shoulder was bandaged where a piece of shrapnel had torn the meat. Finally, he pressed the lead to the paper and wrote a single sentence. "We did not destroy their positions. We only discovered that they are willing to die in them." Kofuka was not a rookie officer experiencing the shock of combat for the first time. He was a veteran of the Imperial Japanese Army's 124th Infantry Regiment. He had fought through the muddy campaigns in French Indochina, survived the assault on Borneo, and stood on the docks of Singapore to watch the British Army march into captivity. He understood the mathematics of war. He knew when a line was supposed to break. Yet, for 3 days, Kofuka had watched his company launch wave after wave of bayonet assaults against a grassy ridge south of Henderson Field. The defenders were out of rations. They were cut off from their ships. By every calculation taught at the Imperial Military Academy, the Americans should have retreated or surrendered. Instead, they stayed in their mud holes, leaving Kofuka to write a sentence that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Kofuka would spend the next 20 years trying to explain why. He never really could. Kofuka wasn't the only officer writing reports like this. Across Guadalcanal, in the diaries of dead lieutenants and the coded transmissions sent to Rabaul, the same observation was being made. The enemy did not run. This is the account of what happened when the elite Kawaguchi Detachment of the Imperial Japanese Army came into sustained contact with the 1st Marine Division of the United States. It was a clash that forced Japanese commanders to ask a question that defied their own training manuals. Not why the Americans were winning, but why they refused to break when victory against them was mathematically certain. The men who held the line on Guadalcanal were auto workers, coal miners, and teenagers. The Marine Corps took them and sent them to Paris Island or San Diego. The recruits were stripped of their names, their clothes, and their hair. They were marched through swamps and kept awake for 36 hours at a time. The training was a program of controlled misery, designed to produce a specific psychological orientation, the belief that the unit was the only thing that existed. It was built on a model of absolute decentralization. If the officer died, the corporal took over. If the corporal died, the private first class took the gun. Colonel Merritt Edson described the philosophy in these terms. "We do not train men to follow orders under fire. We train them to make decisions when the orders stop." On August 7, 1942, the 1st Marine Division landed on Guadalcanal. Within 48 hours, the landing turned into a disaster. A Japanese cruiser force surprised the Allied fleet, sinking 4 cruisers in less than an hour. Left without air cover, the American transports fled, taking with them half the Marines' heavy equipment and most of their food. The 11,000 Marines on Guadalcanal were left alone in the mud. They had no radar, no air support, and only enough food for 30 days. Most of it captured Japanese rice infested with weevils. To the Japanese High Command in Rabaul, the situation was clear. The official orders issued to Colonel Kiyonao Ichiki's advanced force read, "The enemy has no will to fight and will scatter into the jungle at the first charge. You will occupy the airfield immediately." They believed the Americans would surrender the moment they realized they were cut off. Instead, within 48 hours, Japanese officers were writing reports they could barely explain. By September, the island had become a green furnace. The temperature rose above 90 degrees Fahrenheit, and malaria and dry rot swept through the marine lines. Men lost 20 pounds in a month. Then came the waiting. Every day, the jungle was dead silent. The heat pressed down like a wet blanket. The Marines cleaned their weapons, shared their last cigarettes, and stared into the dark green wall of the jungle. Then, the noise began. Every night, Japanese cruisers stood offshore and bombarded the Marine positions with 14-inch shells. The ground shook so violently that men vomited in their foxholes from the concussion. The bombardment would stop, the silence would return for 10 minutes, and then the mortar shells would begin to thump in the distance. On the night of September 12, Kawaguchi began his assault on the grassy ridge south of the airfield. The ridge was held by a thin line of raiders and paramarines under Colonel Edson. They had no sandbags, no wire, and very little ammunition. The Japanese attacked in waves, throwing firecrackers and shouting slogans to break the defenders' nerve. At the height of the fighting, the Marine lines were bypassed and cut into isolated pockets. Edson, standing near the crest of the ridge, called for artillery support. He did not ask for a barrage in front of his lines. He gave the coordinates for the ridge itself. He called the shells down directly on his own positions, betting that the Marines in their shallow holes would survive the shrapnel, while the Japanese attacking in the open would be shredded. The artillery saved the ridge. It also created a mystery the Japanese command would spend weeks trying to understand. The reports arriving at Japanese headquarters reveal a growing, clinical confusion, but the length and tone of these accounts varied widely. Some were brief, written in haste. A Japanese corporal named Hayashi wrote a single line home before his unit assaulted the western flank. "We thought they were not human." Others were formal, trying to find a bureaucratic category for the anomaly. Major Yusaku Koyama filed an analytical assessment for the Imperial General Staff. The Marine does not try to escape when surrounded. In our doctrine, a force that is cut off from supply is considered defeated. The Marines, however, do not seem to recognize this status. They remain in their holes and fire in all directions. And some were written by officers who had witnessed the destruction firsthand. Captain Suzuki Masai, a company officer who survived the assault on the river spit, wrote, "We expected the Americans to be afraid of dying. They were not afraid. This was the problem. They do not retreat when their officers are killed. They simply continue to fire from the mud." By the end of the campaign, Japanese officers would begin using a phrase that appeared nowhere in their doctrine, a phrase that began as a rumor, but would soon haunt the high command. To understand what that logic looked like in practice, you have to look at the individual men who stood in the mud. Corporal John Rivers was a 22-year-old from Hickory, North Carolina. He was a machine gunner with the 1st Marine Division, positioned near the Tanaru River on the night of August 21st. A Japanese force of 900 men under Colonel Ichiki attempted to cross the river sandbar. Rivers' machine gun position was the primary obstacle. The Japanese targeted the gun with mortars and grenades. Rivers' loader went down, his chest torn by shrapnel. Rivers himself was hit in the arm. Then, the gun jammed. He could hear the Japanese boots splashing in the shallow water, coming closer. He had 30 seconds. He could run back to the secondary line, or he could stay. Rivers stayed. He pulled a pocket knife, cleared the jammed cartridge, loaded a new belt, and opened fire again. He kept firing until a Japanese bullet struck him in the head. When his body was recovered the next morning, his finger was still frozen around the trigger. There were 200 dead enemy soldiers in the sand in front of his position. His squad leader's reply to the lieutenant was recorded in the unit report. John said he had the best angle. If he moved, the gun was no good, so he stayed. Private First Class Albert Schmid was a 21-year-old from Philadelphia. He was in the same squad as John Rivers. After Rivers was killed, Schmid took over the machine gun. During the height of the assault, a Japanese grenade landed in his pit. The explosion did not just tear his flesh, it extinguished the world. Schmid found himself in absolute, sudden darkness, his eyes gone, his face wet with blood. In that dark, the only sound was the screaming of the Japanese and the cracking of rifles. He did not leave the position. He sat in the dark, his hands covered in blood, and continued to load and fire the gun by sound alone, guided by the instructions of a wounded corporal named Lee Susi who lay beside him. Schmid fired over 4,000 rounds during the action. He survived the night. In the morning, when they evacuated him to a field hospital, the doctor looked at Schmid's face, then looked down at his hands, which were blistered and blackened from the heat of the barrel. The doctor realized that Schmid had been firing completely blind, relying entirely on the voice of a dying man to aim. The doctor stood over him in silence for a long moment, then wrote in his report that he had no medical explanation for how the man was still conscious. Schmid's response was plain. "I knew where the river was. I knew where the guys were. I just kept my hand on the spade. On the left flank of the ridge, the Japanese encountered Private First Class Cletus Miller, an 18-year-old from Elkhart, Indiana. On the night of September 13th, the Japanese launched a flanking maneuver designed to bypass the ridge entirely and take the airfield from the rear. If they succeeded, the entire Marine Division would be split. Miller was 18 years old. He had been in combat for less than a week, and he was terrified. In the dark, with his rifle jammed, he did not clear the mud out of a sense of duty. He did it because the alternative was letting a bayonet enter his throat. He cleared the mud with a pocket knife while under direct fire, and then used his helmet to beat back a Japanese soldier who attempted to climb into his trench. He held the flank alone for 3 hours, preventing the flanking force from realizing the line was empty. When the sun came up, his platoon leader found him sitting on the edge of the hole. The lieutenant realized that Miller had unknowingly saved the entire flank of the division from being overrun. Miller didn't know it. He just looked at his rifle and said, "This was the spot they gave me. If I went back, I'd just have to climb the hill again." Rivers, Schmid, and Miller weren't isolated anomalies. They were part of a pattern that Kawaguchi was now trying to solve. Kawaguchi kept rereading the reports. The numbers weren't wrong. The maps weren't wrong. Something else was. Every surviving officer was describing the same behavior using different words. They described men who fought from inside themselves. Weeks later, after the remnants of his detachment had been pulled back to the coast, Kawaguchi sat in a tent in Rabaul and finally wrote down the 2 words he believed explained the mystery. Volitional inflexibility. He defined it as a structural defect in the American soldier's relationship with retreat. He wrote, "The Marine infantryman operates under a condition of volitional inflexibility. They do not view a position as a coordinate on a map. They view it as a personal possession. This makes them tactically inefficient, as they will die for ground of no value, but it makes them nearly impossible to dislodge through standard infantry assault." Here was the counterintuitive truth of Guadalcanal. The Japanese military operated on the assumption that Western soldiers fought logically and would surrender when surrounded and out of supplies. The Marines defied this by viewing death not as a defeat, but as an acceptable tactical choice. The man who fights to live can be broken by pain, cold, and hunger. But the man who has decided that death is an acceptable outcome has freed himself from fear. That freedom was what made them impossible to break. On the night of September 13th, Kawaguchi launched his final, coordinated assault on Bloody Ridge. He had aligned his remaining forces for a single, decisive breakthrough. The battle became a race against the clock. 2200 hours. The Japanese artillery opens fire. The ridge is illuminated by the flashes of shells. The first wave of Japanese infantry charges through the grass. The Marine line bends. Pockets of raiders are cut off, but they do not retreat. 2300 hours. The fighting becomes hand-to-hand in the dark. Japanese soldiers use bayonets and swords. The Marines fight back with knives, helmets, and entrenching tools. 0200 hours. Kawaguchi's second wave hits the center of the ridge. Lieutenant Tanabe writes in his logbook, "We have reached the crest. We have taken 30 meters. We have lost 76 men. The Americans are still firing from the reverse slope." 0230 hours. A brief, heavy silence falls over the ridge. The rain stops. A Marine named Private James Miller looks around his trench. The loader is dead. The radio is smashed. He is alone. He pulls out a pack of cigarettes, lights the last one, and shares it with a wounded man who cannot speak. They wait in the dark. For almost a minute, nobody fired. The ridge became unnaturally quiet. Marines could hear wounded Japanese calling for medics somewhere below. Then, someone screamed. The final assault began. 0330 hours. The silence breaks. The Marine ammunition is nearly gone. Men are sharing cartridges from the dead. The Japanese are within 50 meters of the airfield's runway. The command post is under direct fire. If the line breaks now, the campaign is over. 0500 hours. The sky begins to gray in the east. The final Japanese assault wave is launched, but the Marines on the ridge, bleeding, starving, and out of ammunition, counterattack with bayonets. The Japanese line breaks. The assault force collapses. Captain Shigetoshi Kofuka survived the war. In 1964, he was living in a small, quiet suburb of Tokyo, teaching history to schoolchildren. A Japanese historian came to interview him about the Guadalcanal campaign. The historian asked him if he had ever found the mistake in his plans. Kofuka sat in his chair. He did not answer immediately. His old, wrinkled hands trembled as he poured a cup of tea. He looked out at his small garden in silence for nearly a minute. Finally, he spoke. "I spent 20 years looking for the mistake. I checked the maps. I checked the weather reports. I checked the ammunition counts." He looked down at his tea. "We did not destroy their positions." He quoted the words he had written in his diary on September 14, 1942. "We only discovered that they are willing to die in them." He looked up. They were just men who refused to move. The 1st Marine Division left Guadalcanal in December 1942. They had lost 650 men killed in action, with another 1,200 wounded. They had destroyed an elite Japanese detachment and proved that the Marine Corps had built exactly the kind of men it intended to build. The Japanese military would spend the next 3 years trying to find a tactical response to that decision. They would call it by many names, but in the private files of the 17th Army, it remained under the label Kawaguchi had given it. Volitional Inflexibility. 80 years later, historians still debate Guadalcanal. Captain Kofuka's single sentence explains it better than thousands of pages ever could.